All right, so the Android community has a problem. It's not that that Android created this whole infrastructure around activities as the only way to write apps. They fixed that. They came out with Fragments. The real problem is that developers aren't using it. Businesses aren't prioritizing it. So as a developer, I want you to leave here today and write a fragment with your next activity. If you're a business person, then I want you to leave knowing why you should be doing fragments now, why you should start now instead of later whenever you'll have to renovate everything. So for me, I started with fragments last year. At Xfinity, the Comcast app, we first wrote a phone app, and then we renovated right after Fragments came out last February or March. It was really worth the investment for our business because we wanted to show video on the tablet. We wanted feature parity with the iOS app that already had tablet. Now for the ETE app, which I redid the Android user interface for it this last time, I started integrating Fragments, but I didn't redo the whole app. I didn't go back and renovate everything and make a tablet app, but they're there. And it doesn't look any different than a normal phone app. And then finally, on the other end of the spectrum, whenever I start a new personal project, I integrate Fragments from the very get-go. It's a lot easier to start with them than it is to go back and renovate them. And we'll go over both of those later. So first, let's talk about what Fragments are. So they allow you to write different view components and recombine them on different UI things, like this over here. So different form factors, you can combine them. You can do 2 here, 5 here, depends on what you want to do. Came out with Honeycomb last year. It's central to how Honeycomb does things, also ice cream sandwich, and it's probably going to be the way that Google does things for the future. So if you look at this Mint app activity here, so we've got 3 different colored spots. I did purple, red, and green. That's showing different things that they've combined together into one logical UI component. But if you did this on a phone, you'd probably have each one of these in their own separate activity that you would click through. Now, if you did it on TV, you might combine it in a different way. Or even landscape might be completely different from this as well. But you only write that code once and then reuse it on all of those form factors. So let's talk a little bit about the community. There's a lot of devices out there. Not a lot of them are tablets, but there are a lot of devices. Lots of apps. There could be more. And then we get new devices daily. That's a pretty high number of daily activated devices. Unfortunately, most of those devices are pre-Honeycomb, which means they are not tablets. Honeycomb is definitely tablets. Ice cream sandwich is a mix of tablets and phones. And that other 6% is a pretty much dead heat between the two. So you have both ice cream sandwich and Honeycomb. So that's, I would guess, probably maybe 4 or 5% tablets, maybe. But this has also changed 2% in the last month. Whenever I first got this statistic, it was over 95% was pre-Honeycomb. So it is changing. Now this I thought was pretty telling. If you're an Android developer, you spend a lot of time on Stack Overflow trying to figure out how to do this stuff. The majority of the questions there's lots of questions about Android, but there's very, very few, about 0.5% actually about Fragments. So 0.5% of developers are asking stuff about Fragments, which I thought was just kind of mind-blowing. But also I've been doing it for a year. So why wouldn't businesses want to do it? Well, if you're a business person, the word re-architecting or refactoring should send shivers down your spine. It spends a lot of time going back and spending money to basically refurbish what you already have for the same functionality. And like I mentioned, there's very few tablets out there right now, so it might be high risk to do this. But we are at a point where you can define the market for the future. So do you really want to wait until your users are demanding that you have it, that you're just giving them what they expect, instead of doing something and delighting them early on? Let's see. So hopefully this will give you a little bit of insight into the sort of problem we're facing right now. Come on. Did we get the Ethernet drop? Oh. OK, well, so this video is talking. Oh, good. Can anyone hear that? Where's the audio? OK, well, this video was talking about a chicken and egg situation. So basically what's going on here is that developers are waiting for people to buy tablets. Well, so tablets, driving app purchases, tablets, an app purchase is driving tablets. So because nobody's buying the tablets, nobody's making the apps because nobody's buying the tablets. It's deadlock. Nobody's ever going to get anywhere if we stay in this current situation. As far as engineering case goes, there's always new APIs that come out with each new OS flavor that you can use, and with that comes best practices. One of the nice things about Fragments is it really allows you to use your code again in different areas and manage multiple screens a lot easier. And quite frankly, if you're writing Android code without Fragments in it, you're writing legacy code right now that you're going to have to renovate down the road. So hopefully you won't stay in this state for too long. Tablets will catch on. They will go somewhere. It is time to start doing Fragments. So you have a few different approaches that you can do. So one, you can just start from scratch, either throw your app away or just start a brand new project and use Fragments from the outset. That is the easiest way to go, but it doesn't always make sense for every business. So like I mentioned with Comcast, we did a full renovation. Made sense for us at the time, but not everyone has the time to invest in a full renovation right now. The approach I'm going to talk about the most is starting from here. You can start writing a fragment today, renovate the rest whenever you need to, but just start writing it now, and then you won't have to renovate those pieces down the road. So now that we've talked a little bit about why you might want to do them, what the problems are, let's talk about how you actually write them and use them. So how many people have written activities before? It's really, really easy to write a fragment if you've already written an activity. Most of the code that lives in the activity now lives in the fragment. That's about it. There's a little bit more wiring that goes on, but that's the basic idea. So they're sub-activities. They have to live in an activity, a host. You can have several fragments or one fragment, your choice. They don't have to have a view. They can be invisible worker fragments, if you prefer. You never want them to talk to each other. You want them to be loosely coupled. You want them to talk through the activity if they need to talk in any way. And then you have precise control over the fragment manager. So you can either use the standard backstack where it just adds each new fragment back on the backstack for you, or you can swap things out, add, remove, replace. You even have control over whether or not you put that on the backstack. That's your choice. So if you're not familiar with the backstack, it's just each screen that you go through in the app is just placed on top of each other. You press the back button to go back through them. It also gives you the ability to handle config changes a bit better. So before, whenever you turn the tablet, it would just kill your activity. And also, if you don't set retain instance to true, then it'll kill your fragments as well. But you can keep them around, and depending on what your needs are. And then also, after you turn the device, you can figure out whether or not a certain fragment is showing right now. So it's got nice availability for that. You can see whether or not it's hidden, whether or not it's in the layout right now. So that's all great, theoretical stuff. Let's talk about the code. So the general idea of how you're going to wire all these classes together to do the views now, you're going to have an activity, and then that's going to set the content view as it always did, except now this main is different. This main is going to be fragments that are specified in your layout instead of different UI components. So in this case, for the name, we have the full qualified name, so it tells you exactly where to find it. It takes that name, and then it creates an instance of this fragment for you. And then where you're inflating this view here, that's what you would have before inflated in the activity. So that's where you put all your UI components and stuff. So before this is going to get more and more technical. So if you have any questions, just let me know and I will help you out. So now that we have this overall, this is how it's wiring, let's look a little bit more fleshed out of what those would actually look like. So after you declare your layout, you're going to do that with either in your single pane, you're just going to have probably one fragment in there. You might throw other UI components in, your choice. This looks just like before. You can tell it how wide and how tall you want it to be. And you give it an ID so you can find it later with the fragment manager. So for the dual pane, you're going to have two different fragments in here. We're not going to talk about the hello fragment at the bottom, but we will go into the welcome fragment at the top there. So the only difference is there's one fragment here, two fragments here. If you're familiar with how layouts are chosen by the system, you put them in different folders. So This is now outdated, but the way that you do it is you have a normal layout folder, layout-large, layout-extra large. And extra large is for the tablet. So you would put this dual pane one in the -extra large folder right now. And then you would put this one in the standard layout folder. So the new way to do it is you say, well, I want my screen to be 600, well, this design here works up until 600 dp, and then after that I'm going to do it, you know, from 800 to 1000, it's going to be this other one. So it's going to be more of like a responsive web design sort of thing. Okay, so now that we have that layout, we want to show it. So in the activity, the big difference here is that we're going to extend fragment activity instead of regular activity. It just says, I'm in activity, I want fragments. And we're going to set the content view to the main that has the 2 fragments or 1 fragment in it. Okay, and then you write the fragment. So you're going to extend fragment as your type. There's a few different types here. You have a list or a dialogue or a preference. It's up to you what you need for the time. After you create and extend that fragment, this is pretty similar to the activity code from before. You're inflating a layout, and this is the layout that would typically be in your main right now. And you use that layout that you've inflated to find the views by ID instead of just find view by ID. And then, just as before, you specify XML in the welcome.xml, the one that's specified in the fragment. So any questions on how you would wire it together or how you're going to use fragments in relation to activities? No? Okay. Cool, so that was pretty static. It was just showing one view. This is how you're going to manage it if you're going to do multiple views, and how you might figure out, oh, well, this one click should do this versus this on this device. So that's going to look something like this. So in our tablet, we have 2 fragments, and in our phone, we have 1 fragment. They both use the same activity that defines them, but whenever you click on things in the tablet, you just want to update your current activity instead of starting something new. But on the phone, you're going to start a new activity. And this new activity will never be used on the tablet. It's a completely parallel set of activities that are only going to be used for the phone. So let's look at what that looks like. We're going to go through the tablet side of things first. So first we have an activity. It gets created. And then Android figures out, am I a tablet or am I a phone? So we're going to go tablets. So the XML looks something like this. It says there's 2 different fragments in here, a list fragment and a detail fragment. We're just showing the default view here. And let's see, let's click on the list item. Once we do that, the list fragment itself will handle that click. And then it calls a function in main activity called show detail. Now show detail is going to figure out what you should do. So that looks like this. If there's a dual pane, we're going to update. And if not, then we're going to start a detail activity. So just how to figure out whether or not it's a dual pane looks something like this. You're going to get access to the support fragment manager if you're doing, so the difference between support fragment manager and the regular fragment manager, I forgot to mention before that you can use fragments all the way back into Donut. Whenever Google came out with this whole idea of fragments, they also allowed you to do it on the old phones. So although it's made for here forward, you can also use it on the old stuff. So if you're doing it for older phones and newer phones, you'll use the support fragment manager instead of the regular fragment manager. It's your decision where you draw that line. So here we're getting access to the fragment manager, and we're just looking to see if there is that fragment in the view. So you give it the ID, the r.id.detail fragment. That's what we talked about earlier, where you put the ID in the XML for that fragment, and that's what it's referencing. So we figure out, is the detail fragment here? Does it exist? Is it visible? Okay, so it is visible on the tablet. So we're just going to update. That'll look something like this. So now if we click on this button here, we have a detail fragment on click, and then it just starts a brand new activity. Okay, so that's the tablet path through. Any questions on that? Okay, so let's talk about the phone. Now it's going to do the same thing where we have a main XML. This one's going, for the phone, it's going to be pulled out of the phone folder and figure out, oh, I just have one list fragment in here. So you're going to show a phone with one fragment on it. this case, same click. That's going to go back to the main activity. Well, first it talks to that fragment, which says show detail. It's going to do the same check that it did before. Should I update or should I start a new activity? This time, it's not dual pane, so it's going to start a different activity. It's got this function called start detail, which is going to call detail activity create. And then it's going to pull out the XML that only this phone will ever see. And that's the detail XML. Has one fragment in it, looks like this. And clicking on this button does the same thing that the tablet one did. Now we have a brand new tablet activity, and we've come back to the same part. Cool. So this took quite a while to figure out from the documentation. Yes?
I don't know if you're going to talk about it later, but the show detail function is defined in the main activity.
It is.
So how does the on-click from the fragment close out to the...
You always have access to your activity in a fragment. It's just a call called getActivity. So getActivity.showDetailFragment. Yeah. Cool. So the documentation talks about this whole idea of having multiple activities and multiple fragments, but it's pretty convoluted. I spent a lot of time creating this document because I just couldn't understand it from just the words alone. I like pictures. I just do. So now let's talk about how you might go through upgrading if you already have an app that has activities in it. As you can see, this is quite a few steps as compared to the previous one. So first, you're going to extend the fragment activity. So you're just going to change activity, fragment activity. Like I mentioned before, the support library if you want to do it back to older apps, older devices. So now you're going to cut all the code from your activity, and you're going to paste it into your fragment. So it's complete duplicate. I usually just copy the file and then change the name, but that's what I do. Now for fragment, the main entry point instead of on create is on create view. So that's going to look something like this, where you get an inflator, a container, and an instance. And you're going to use that to inflate the view you're going to use. So like I mentioned, you're going to inflate the XML. This is what the activity was previously looking at. Now the fragment's going to be using it. And then now that we have a reference to that layout, we're going to do layout.findViewById instead of just the activity using findViewById. And I'm going to release, I've done 2 projects on GitHub where I went back through and renovated Google's framework. Oh, not framework, they have some apps, some sample apps, and I went through and made them fragment friendly. So I'll give you the link to that so you can work through them if you want to play with it later. Okay, and then now you set the main view by doing the set content view in the activity. That's pretty much the entirety of your activity right now. It's just that one onCreate function that says, I have this one view, and that's it. And then you create your XML. And if you want to do a tablet, you'd also create a dual pane XML instead of just this one XML right here. And then there's a bunch of other small things that you'll have to fix that it's really hard to figure out right now what those might need to be. A lot of times, if you prepend getActivity on the front of a red squiggly line in your IDE, then that'll help you out there. Also, you're going to have to, at some point, disentangle some of the logic. And it's always a great time to refactor. But if you have unit tests, then you're going to have to rewrite those to test the fragment instead of the activity. And finally, if you want to see it on a tablet instead of on just a phone, you're going to need to change your target SDK to Honeycomb and above. So this is the process for upgrading. There's lots of steps here, 7, maybe 50, not sure. Or you can just write it from scratch, from right now, from the next activity and the next fragment you write. You have this versus this. I think the choice is pretty clear, personally. Okay, so overall, fragments are pretty cool. You can start using them now. You can stop writing legacy code. You don't have to write a tablet app to use them. You can use them today. And then if you do want to write a tablet app down the road, then you won't have to go back and renovate everything. You'll just have to go back and renovate the things that don't have fragments in them. So are there any questions? Because that's pretty much it. Yeah?
Were they designed to enable you to do something that you could not do at all before? Was it just
you could do it before, but so basically you would have to do a little view group here, well, you could specify in XML, I want this little layout here, hide it, show it, and then you would be hiding and showing all these different bits, and it would be kind of a nightmare. Yeah, so this really helps you do that better. Any other questions? Yes?
Are you going to post these slides?
I am, yes. I know you have burning questions.
Is there
Yeah.
if you start a new Android project with Eclipse, then it starts it without fragments.
It does, yes.
Is there an IDE tool that helps you build fragments, or?
I wish.
Okay.
There is not. There's a lot of discussion in the community that we should make it a lot easier for people to start out with fragments. I mean, there's still things that are being created today. I've seen, you know, training classes and stuff that don't even talk about fragments. Like, how can you never mention it if you're going to create an entire class around Android? I don't know. So.
Because it's so hard to keep up with the changes.
Yeah.
That's the reason.
Yeah, definitely. Solid question back there. Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering what was used to develop the
Prezi.
presentation.
Prezi, P-R-E-Z-I. Yes, Joe.
How is the life cycle of fragments different from the life cycle of an activity?
Okay, so they each have their own separate life cycles. The activity is longer running, and then the fragment one kind of hooks in at different points. There's 2 different graphs out there on their official documentation that show exactly which subset of the fragment life cycle is the same, which falls into the different activity ones. I ended up cutting that out of here just because I thought it might be a little too deep. But yeah, so they tie up, but they're also separate. You have to manage both life cycles.
Is one more likely to die?
So with the set retain instance true, fragments are less likely to die if you do config changes and stuff like that. The activity will kill all the fragments that are inside of it or start all of them whenever it starts up or stops. So the activity, I guess, would be the one who's more likely to die and then kill everything with it.
Right. So I guess the question is the on create in comparison to the on resume of an activity needs to pay attention to which fragments it owns and which ones may or may not currently exist.
It'll have access to all of those. So even if you're like, so what do you mean exactly?
So if the OS chooses not to kill my activity, but to kill fragments that are currently owned by my activity, so reclaimed memory or something like that, my on resume needs to pay attention to the fact that it may or may not have an instance of an active fragment living underneath it currently?
I haven't run into that yet. I think because we use set retain instance true pretty much everywhere, that it's not as likely that your fragments are going to get killed off whenever you have an activity. Also with the tablets that are typically using the activities and fragments where you have several of them at once, it doesn't usually need to reclaim nearly as often as a phone might.
Right, yeah. Okay.
Yes?
Do you know of any good books or books at all that cover fragments, or for that matter, good Android development?
So there's a book coming out that has been delayed a little bit, so it should be out in May. But Roto Meyer wrote Professional Development for, I forget the exact title, but they've got a really great book. The second one was great, came out 2 years ago. The fourth one, version 4, is coming out in May, written by Roto Meyer. It's written for programmers, by programmers, I think is the byline on the book. And there's also Pro Android 4 that just came out. I haven't checked that one out. Pro Android 3 I was a little disappointed with because they took their 2 and smacked on like 4 little small chapters about fragments and didn't really talk about them other than these things exist. So, yes?
The description you're talking about, it sounded like you were going to provide or talk about compatibility with older versions of fragments, but it sounds like honeycomb is it, right?
No, so sorry, I kind of glossed over that. There's a support library that you just basically download it and integrate it in your project, and it means that anywhere back to Donut, you can use fragments in there. The only thing that I've found as a casualty is expandable list activity. That's why the ETE app didn't end up getting renovated, just because I would have had to throw away half the UI and redo it because it wasn't supported in that support fragment manager stuff. Anybody else? Yes?
I'm in education, and I just wanted to call out your ostrich slide. We in the education field are fully aware of, by 2015, every student is going to have his or her own tablet, whether it's their own smartphone or, iPad. So we're really sensitive to the fact that we don't have a lot of applications that will help us there in that education field. But it's great that you're trying to get people to write to it.
Plus, I'll have other people to talk to. Right now, I know about 6 developers that have ever touched Fragments, and it's been out an entire year. So that's kind of frustrating, because I just basically have to figure out everything by myself, or talk to those 4 or 5 people. Any other questions? Well, thanks for coming out. It's a pleasure.